Donald Trump's convoy rumbled down the narrow dirt road, a trail of dust curling into the late afternoon air. The sunlight cast long shadows over the golden fields, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, a quiet testament to decades of hard work and generational perseverance. John Mitchell had spent years fighting for his farm, watching his policies made in Washington chipped away at his livelihood, threatening to turn his family's legacy into just another forgotten piece of America's rural past. He had extended an invitation, but he never truly believed Trump would come. Politicians made promises from podiums. They didn't show up in the middle of a working farm. Yet, as the convoy slowed and the black SUVs came to a halt, John realized this wasn't just another empty gesture. This was something different. Stepping back, he wiped the sweat and dirt off his hands, pressing them against his faded denim jeans. The scent of tilled earth and sun-dried hay filled the air, mixing with the distant hum of insects and the occasional clank of metal from the barn. He wasn't the type to be starstruck, especially not by politicians. But there was no denying the weight of the moment. This wasn't a handshake at a campaign rally or a staged press event. This was his land, his fight. And for the first time, someone from the highest seat of power had come to see it firsthand. The door of the lead SUV swung open with practiced precision. Trump stepped out, his dark suit in stark contrast to the rugged, dust-covered landscape around him. He paused for a moment, adjusting his jacket, scanning the endless expanse of farmland that stretched in every direction. There was no press, no teleprompters, no carefully crafted speech. Just two men standing in the open air, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. This wasn't the kind of setting Trump was accustomed to, but if the firm set of his jaw meant anything, he was ready for whatever conversation was about to unfold. John took a step forward, extending a strong, callous hand. There were no rehearsed pleasantries, no unnecessary words. Just a handshake that carried the weight of generations of struggle. Their eyes met. One man a titan of business and politics, the other a living representation of America's forgotten backbone. "Glad you made it," John said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. Trump nodded, brushing a speck of dust off his sleeve. "I hear you have something to say." John's expression didn't shift. He wasn't here to waste time. "Yeah, I do. But first, I want you to see what we're fighting for. Before we go any further, if you're hooked on this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe. The next part will leave you speechless." Inside John's modest farmhouse, the air carried the warmth of home and the weight of history. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee curled through the room, mingling with the buttery scent of cornbread cooling on the counter. The kitchen was a well-worn testament to the past, a space that had seen both laughter and hardship, victories and losses. The wooden table bore the scars of time, each scratch and dent telling a silent story of countless meals shared, decisions made, and moments of reflection. Against the walls, faded photographs framed and told a story no politician could truly understand. A young John stood next to his father, his small hands gripping the steering wheel of a tractor that had long since broken down. Another photo, yellowed with age, captures grandfather shaking hands with Judge at county fair, his weathered face beaming as he held up a blue ribbon, the reward for a harvest well earned. These weren't just decorations. They were fragments of a legacy, a tangible connection to the generations of Mitchells who had tilled this land before him. But now, that legacy was slipping away. The men sat across from each other, the silence thick with unspoken truths. John didn't waste time with small talk. He couldn't afford to. He leaned forward, resting his rough, calloused hands on the table, and laid out the reality in blunt, measured words. Farming had changed. It was no longer just about hard work and resilience. Those things still mattered, but they weren't enough to keep the lights on, the equipment running, or the next season secured. The industry had turned into a battlefield, where the enemies weren't droughts or bad harvests, but corporate monopolies and distant policymakers making decisions from air-conditioned offices. He spoke of the skyrocketing costs of fuel and fertilizer, expenses that ate into profits before crops even left the fields. He explained how subsidies, meant to help the little guys, always seemed to benefit the giants instead. He painted a picture of farmers trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape, one where each season was a gamble, where even the hardest work wasn't enough to guarantee survival. And for John, this wasn't just about numbers on a ledger. This was personal. Every rising expense wasn't just another statistic. It was a meal his family couldn't afford, a payment he couldn't make, another sleepless night wondering if the farm would still be standing next year. It was a painful realization that his son, his grandchildren, might never have the chance to carry on the work of generations before them. Trump sat back in his chair, the usual confidence in his expression, giving way to something more measured. He'd heard complaints before from farmers, from small business owners, from struggling industries. But this wasn't a campaign rally. There were no crowds, no cameras, no flashing lights. Just a man who had spent his entire life fighting for something that was being taken from him, piece by piece. And for the first time, Trump wasn't just listening to the words. He was beginning to feel the weight of them, because this wasn't just about money. This was about preserving an entire way of life before it disappeared forever. John didn't just want Trump to hear his words. He needed him to understand them in a way that couldn't be ignored. So, without another word, he stood from the table and motioned for Trump to follow. They stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind them, into the crisp country air. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. This land wasn't just where John lived. It was where he fought, where he struggled, where his entire existence was tied to the rhythm of the seasons. He led Trump past the weather barn, its wooden beams worn soft from decades of sun and rain, toward a piece of equipment that had seen more harvests than some men see birthdays. The tractor, its once bright paint now faded and chipped, sat sturdy, its massive tires half covered in dust from the morning's work. It wasn't new. It wasn't sleek. But it was the heart of the farm, the machine that kept everything moving, the difference between feeding a family and losing everything. John ran his hand along the metal, feeling the roughness of time etched into its frame. Then, without preamble, he turned to Trump. "You're going to drive it," he said simply. Trump let out a short chuckle, raising an eyebrow as if waiting for the punchline. But John wasn't joking. He gestured toward the seat, and for a brief moment, Trump hesitated, not out of reluctance, but out of the rare realization that this was a stage event. There were no photographers, no flashing lights, no reporters ready to spin the moment. Just him, a machine built for endurance, and a farmer who had nothing left to prove. With a small nod, Trump climbed up onto the tractor, settling into the cracked leather seat. John stood beside him, one hand gripping the side rail as he gave quick, precise instructions. The ignition clicked, the engine roared to life, and suddenly the conversation about policy seemed a million miles away. As Trump's hands gripped the wheel, the weight of the machine was unlike anything he had controlled before. The rumbling beneath him wasn't just mechanical. It was the pulse of labor, the sheer force of a life built on grit and resilience. Each adjustment had to be deliberate. A slight miscalculation, and the entire operation could veer off course. The massive tires churned the dirt, and the endless expanse of land ahead made it clear. This was no simple task. The machine moved forward, but this wasn't about power or speed. It was about precision, patience, and endurance, qualities that no amount of money or influence could buy. Trump's usual confidence faded into concentration, his grip tightening on the controls, his expression hardening as he focused on the path ahead. He wasn't just driving a tractor. He was feeling the weight of the responsibility that came with it. John watched, arms crossed, nodding slightly. This was what he had wanted. Not for Trump to simply listen, but for him to experience, to understand, in a way that couldn't be debated or dismissed, that farming wasn't just a business. It was survival, built on a kind of effort that never truly stopped. Minutes passed, and when Trump finally brought the tractor to a halt, he exhaled, stepping down with a different posture than before. He looked back at the machine, at the dirt-covered tires, at the vastness of the field stretching before him. Something had shifted. This was no longer just a discussion about policy or numbers on a spreadsheet. For the first time, Trump understood that this fight wasn't just about profits, regulations, or industry standards. This was personal. John didn't let the silence stretch too long. The opportunity was in front of him, and he knew that moments like this, real, unfiltered moments where the truth could break through the noise, were rare. He turned to Trump, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had built his entire career on confidence, negotiation, and the art of making the impossible happen. But here, in the middle of this sprawling farm, none of that mattered. John's voice was steady, but behind it was a lifetime of frustration, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to let his way of life disappear without a fight. His words cut through the stillness like a blade. If we fail, America's food supply fails. The simplicity of the statement carried an undeniable weight. There was no hyperbole, no dramatization, just the truth. A truth that, until this moment, had been buried under economic reports, political debates, and the ever-growing gap between rural America and the decision-makers in Washington. This wasn't about just one farm. It wasn't about just John Mitchell or the thousands of other struggling farmers like him. It was about the foundation of the country itself, about the land that had fed generations, the hands that had worked it, and the families that had given everything to keep it alive. It was about a nation that had been built on agriculture, but had forgotten the very people who made it possible. Trump didn't answer right away. Instead, he breathed in deeply, letting the scent of the soil, the distant sound of rustling crops, and the sight of the endless fields press into him. He had been in rooms with world leaders, CEOs, and power players, negotiating billion-dollar deals, shaping economic policies, and making decisions that impacted millions. But this was different. There was no podium here, no script, no audience hanging on to his words, no strategist whispering his ear. This wasn't a televised debate or a campaign stop. This was real. His eyes drifted across the farm, the barn, its wooden structure standing firm despite years of wear, the equipment, showing the signs of long hours and necessity-driven repairs, the fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see, a quiet, unspoken testament to the kind of hard work that didn't end when the sun went down. And for the first time, Trump wasn't just seeing land. He was seeing the weight of history, the urgency of the present, and the uncertainty of the future. His usual bravado, the sharp-witted confidence that had carried him through the highest levels of power, wasn't there, not because he had nothing to say, but because, for once, he was taking a moment to actually think. He knew business. He knew numbers, profits, and losses. He had spent his life making deals, winning battles in boardrooms, outmaneuvering competitors, and turning failing ventures into successes. But this wasn't a game of profit margins. This was about people who didn't have a safety net. Farmers like John couldn't afford to lose, because losing didn't mean filing for bankruptcy and moving on to another venture. Losing meant losing everything, their homes, their family legacies, their very ability to put food on the table. And that meant Trump had a decision to make. Was he going to be just another politician, one who came, listened, and left with nothing but a few sound bites? Or was he going to be the man who actually changed something? For the first time, it wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. By the time Trump stepped off John Mitchell's land, the weight of the conversation lingered in the air. The handshake at the end wasn't just a formality. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. The sun was beginning to set, casting an amber glow over the fields. But for the first time in years, John didn't look at his land with uncertainty. He looked at it with hope, and that hope was misplaced. Within days, the discussions that started on John's farm translated into action. What began as a conversation over cornbread and coffee had set off a chain of decisions at the highest levels of government. An executive order was drafted, not just a temporary patch to quiet critics, but a foundational shift in agricultural policy. This was about real, long-term change. The order didn't offer Band-Aid solutions. It wasn't about handouts, temporary relief packages, or empty gestures. It addressed the root of the problem. It tackled the unfair advantage that corporate farming giants had over independent family-owned farms. It imposed stricter regulations on monopolistic food suppliers and ensured that farmers would finally get fair pricing for their crops and livestock. It expanded loan protections for small farms, keeping them from being swallowed whole by financial institutions. It restructured subsidies, making sure they didn't just flow to massive agricultural corporations while independent farmers were left scrambling to stay afloat. When the order was officially signed and announced, the agricultural industry felt the shockwave. News of the decision spread quickly, sending ripples through political circles, Wall Street, and small-town farming communities alike. Some were skeptical. Critics called it a political move, another promise that would never fully materialize. Big corporate players in the farming industry pushed back immediately, scrambling to figure out how the new regulations would affect their dominance over the market. Lobbyists flooded Washington, eager to slow down the momentum. But on the other side, a new energy was rising. Farmers, those who had been ignored for decades, those who had watched their livelihoods diminish while corporations thrived, were watching closely. Many were hesitant to believe that someone in power had finally heard them. Others, for the first time in years, felt a spark of hope reignite. John Mitchell sat in his kitchen, staring at the television as the news anchor detailed the sweeping changes that were now in motion. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug, his mind still trying to process what had happened. For years he had fought. He had written letters, attended town halls, spoken to local officials, only to be dismissed time and time again. And yet, here it was, proof that his voice had mattered. For the first time, the fight hadn't been ignored. For the first time, someone in power had not just listened, but acted. And as he looked out toward the fields that had once felt like a burden too heavy to bear, he felt something unfamiliar settle deep in his chest. Not frustration, not exhaustion, but the quiet realization that this was just the beginning. Months had passed, but the impact of that first visit hadn't faded. The farm was still standing, still producing, but something felt different now. The uncertainty that had once weighed heavy on John Mitchell's shoulders had been replaced with something stronger, a cautious, quiet optimism that had been missing for years. Then, one afternoon, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching against the dirt road broke the familiar stillness. Another convoy of black SUVs approached, kicking up dust just like before. But this time, it wasn't for a campaign stop. There were no flashing cameras, no stage speeches, no crowds waiting to be impressed. This wasn't about public perception. This was personal. Trump had returned, not with a podium, not with rehearsed talking points, but with something far rarer in politics, a willingness to listen. The handshake between them was the same, but it carried new weight. It wasn't just a greeting between a politician and a voter. It was a sign of mutual respect, built not on party lines or campaign promises, but on real conversations and real action. The skepticism that had once lined John's face was gone. He wasn't just hoping for change anymore. He had seen it happen. The two men sat once again at John's old kitchen table, the same spot where their first conversation had unfolded. But this time, the tone was different. The tension had eased. It wasn't a battle of words or an argument for survival. It was a discussion about what came next. The conversation stretched beyond policy now. It was about the long-term future of farming, of families, of an industry that had been at risk of being swallowed whole. They talked about what still needed to be done, about the next steps to ensure that the progress made wouldn't be temporary. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, as they always had, but now they didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a legacy that finally had a fighting chance. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying the man across from him. He had started this fight with doubt, with frustration, with a deep-seated belief that no one in power truly cared. But now, sitting across from the most unlikely ally he could have imagined, he realized something. The voices that made the biggest difference weren't always the loudest. Sometimes, it wasn't the politicians on television or the analysts in newsrooms who shaped the future. Sometimes it was the quiet conversations, the moments where people sat down, spoke plainly and truly listened, that changed everything. And as the last light of the afternoon filtered through the kitchen window, John understood one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of something. This was just the beginning. Sometimes, the most unexpected conversations change history. And this one did.